The virtual meeting of the United Nations Security Council is called to order. Can I start by giving a very warm welcome to you, Secretary General, also to all of the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives. Thank you very much for joining this meeting. And before I start with the formalities of the proceedings before us today, can I just begin by underscoring the importance of the meeting and the issues that we're deliberating on today. We're fighting a global pandemic. We must ensure, I believe it's our mission to ensure an equitable distribution and access to COVID-19 vaccines right around the world to make sure no one is left behind. That must include the most vulnerable, including those languishing in refugee camps or indeed in war-torn conflict zones. That's the focus of our discussions today, and I very much look forward to a very constructive discussion with all of you. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, implementation of Resolution 2532 of 2020. And so with your permission, I will adopt the agenda. Next, we move on to the invitations under Rule 39. And in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I would like to invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Ms. Henrietta Foray, Executive Director of the United Nations Children Fund, Mr. Jagan Chapgayan, Secretary General of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and Dr. Seth Berkley, CEO of Gavi. It is so decided. Now we move on with all of your permissions to consideration of item 2 of the agenda. And so I will draw the attention of council members to document S/2021/138, which is a letter dated the 12th of February 2021 from the permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General and transmitting a concept paper on the item which is before us under consideration. And with that in mind, I will now give the floor to Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterrez, to make his introductory remarks. Antonio, over to you.
Mr. President, and with your permission, I would make a brief introduction and then ask my colleague Henrietta Foray, Executive Director of UNICEF, to develop our briefing. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the United Kingdom for organizing this meeting and for reinforcing my call for a global ceasefire to ease suffering, create space for diplomacy, and enable humanitarian access, including for the delivery of vaccines worldwide. COVID-19 continues its merciless march across the world, upending lives, destroying economies, and undermining the Sustainable Development Goals. And the pandemic is exacerbating all the factors that drive instability, hindering our efforts to implement Security Council Resolution 2532 for the cessation of hostilities, for conflict prevention and resolution. Defeating COVID-19, now that we have begun to have the scientific capacity to do so, is more important than ever. The rollout of COVID-19 vaccines is generating hope. But at this critical moment, vaccine equity is the biggest moral test before the global community. We must ensure that everybody, everywhere, can be vaccinated as soon as possible. Yet progress on vaccinations has been widely uneven and unfair. Just 10 countries have administered 75% of all COVID-19 vaccines. Meanwhile, more than 130 countries had not received a single dose. And those affected by conflict and insecurity are at particular risk of being left behind. When pandemic strikes, we are only safe if everyone is safe. If the virus is allowed to spread like wildfire in the global south or parts of it, it will mutate again and again. And new variants could become more transmissible, more deadly, and potentially threaten the effectiveness of current vaccines and diagnostics. This can prolong the pandemic significantly enabling the virus to come back to plague the global north. And it will also delay the world economic recovery. We have come together to create the COVAX facility, the one global tool to procure and deliver vaccines for low and middle income countries. COVAX requires to be fully funded. But we must do even more. Our efforts need to be comprehensive and well coordinated everywhere. The world urgently needs a global vaccination plan to bring together all those with required power, scientific expertise, and production and financial capacities. I believe the G20 is well placed to establish an emergency task force to prepare such a global vaccination plan and coordinate its implementation and financing. This task force should include all countries in which there is a capacity to develop vaccines or to produce them, if licenses are available, together with WHO, Gavi, other relevant technical organizations, and international financial institutions. And the task force would have the capacity to mobilize the pharmaceutical companies and key industries and logistic actors. I am ready to galvanize the full United Nations system in support of this effort. The G7 meeting later this week can help create the momentum to mobilize the necessary financial resources. Together, we can ensure sufficient supply, fair distribution, and vaccine confidence. And we can defeat this disease. We can get our economies running again. I am convinced it's possible. Let's make it happen together, and I thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General, for your remarks. And now I understand that the Secretary General has to leave the meeting at 9:25 a.m. because of other pressing commitments and priorities. So can I also just take this opportunity to thank you for all of your work, your leadership, and indeed the work on the front line of so many UN staff right around the world. I'll now give the floor to Ms. Henrietta Fore.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, Excellencies, fellow briefers, Secretary Raab. Thank you for convening this debate. UNICEF appreciates the United Kingdom's efforts to shine a light on the importance of equitable access to the COVID-19 vaccines. The only way out of this pandemic, as the Secretary General has just said, for any of us, is to ensure vaccinations are available for all of us. In this historic effort, we must include the millions of people who are living through or fleeing conflict and instability. Equitable access to vaccines for all people, including those living under conflict, is essential. Not only is it a matter of justice, but as the only pathway to ending this pandemic for all, and to sowing the seeds of care, of hope, and even peace in countries that have seen far too little. For UNICEF and our many humanitarian partners working around the world, COVID-19 has fundamentally altered our responses, adding a new layer of complexity in some of the most difficult and dangerous operating environments anywhere. As this Council knows well, the violent, protracted nature of today's armed conflicts shatters countries' health system, damaged or destroyed vital infrastructure like water and sanitation, and spurred the flight of badly needed healthcare workers. In this context, vaccine delivery is also hampered by a funding gap for humanitarian support overall, and by a lack of transportation, cold chains, logistical infrastructure to support the rollout. We need to reach the same populations that are routinely missed with basic services like health, nutrition, and basic immunization, with a vaccine that will not only potentially save their lives, but also help to address the global pandemic. UNICEF is proud to support the WHO-led global response, and we're bringing our decades of experience and expertise to this massive act. We are working with our partners and governments to support country readiness. With our vast field presence in every country, we are working with local and national authorities on preparations and strategies to reach all people, including those in hard-to-reach locations. Using existing immunization infrastructure, we are also working to reach people who are not normally targeted in our immunization programs, including health workers, the elderly, and high-risk groups. And we're helping governments to establish pre-registration systems and prioritizing which people, such as healthcare workers, need to receive vaccines first. We're engaging communities and building trust to defeat misinformation. We are training health workers to deliver vaccine and helping governments to recruit and deploy more health workers where they are needed most. We're advocating with local and national governments to use other proven health measures like masks and physical distancing. And now, through the COVAX facility, we're working with Gavi and WHO and CEPI to procure and deliver the COVID vaccines in the close collaboration with vaccine manufacturers and freight and logistics and storage providers. And we're doing so on a dramatically accelerated timeline. We're aiming to procure 2 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines by the end of this year, 2021. This is on top of the 2 billion doses of other vaccines we normally procure each year on behalf of 100 countries. With our long-standing work in humanitarian contexts, we're adapting, adjusting, and assessing the specific needs in each location. This means, for instance, ensuring that enough doses and syringes are available in each country, and undertaking inventories to ensure that effective cold chain systems are in place. It means procuring those syringes and safety boxes. It means finding ways to ensure distribution and delivery in logistically difficult contexts like Sudan or the Democratic Republic of Congo, or high-threat environments like Yemen or Afghanistan. It means negotiating to populations across multiple lines of control by non-state armed groups, areas that the ICRC estimates represent some 60 million people. It means ensuring that all populations groups, including those that are routinely excluded from support, are covered by national vaccination plans, no matter their legal, economic, or political status. This includes refugees, migrants, and those who are deprived of their liberty. And we've joined a global effort to secure vaccines under the humanitarian buffer that can be used as a measure of last resort. COVAX has set aside 5% of its doses as backup stock for at-risk populations like refugees, the internally displaced, and migrants. In short, it is a safety net for those not covered by national immunization programs. But as we prepare for this historic rollout, we need the support of this Council. So may I build on the Secretary General's calls. First, join our call to all member states to ensure that everyone is included in national vaccination plans, regardless of their legal status or if they live in areas controlled by non-state entities. Second, we need a global ceasefire. At a minimum, we need your help to extend the call made in Resolution 2532 for a humanitarian pause for the duration of the vaccine delivery and administration. And third, help us to restart stalled immunization campaigns for other diseases like measles, diphtheria, and polio. We cannot allow this fight against one deadly disease to cause us to lose ground in our fight against others. Over the last year, the global community has come together to develop, manufacture, distribute, and deliver this vaccine in record time. So in closing, may I say that this historic effort deserves historic support. Help us ensure that the light at the end of the tunnel shines on us all, including the families and communities enduring the horrors of conflict. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Four. Thank you for your briefing and for all the work that the Children's Fund is doing. I now turn and give the floor to Dr. Seth Barkley.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, thank you for inviting me to brief the Security Council on a topic that will define our common success in addressing the pandemic through equitable access to vaccines. Let me also thank my partners, Henrietta and Jagan, who are here with me today. For a global pandemic, as the Secretary General has said, we're only safe if we're all safe. If there are countries where large numbers of at-risk people are not vaccinated, it not only threatens those countries, but the rest of the world as the new variants popping up in different countries attests. So the first goal is to assure equitable access, but we can't stop there. To succeed, we need to ensure that vulnerable at-risk populations everywhere have access to life-saving vaccines. This means not forgetting the millions of people in conflict-affected settings, for it is in these last-mile communities where the meaning of equity is most pronounced. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare deep systemic inequities between and within societies, exacerbating grievances and conflicts along the way. Progress on poverty eradication, nutrition, education, and immunization coverage have all fallen back, and the poorest and most vulnerable communities are hardest hit by the pandemic. Despite the UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, conflicts and political violence have continued or even intensified. The pandemic is more than a global health crisis. It's a significant challenge to international peace and security that can only be addressed through multilateral cooperation. Global GDP is expected to fall by as much as $9.2 trillion in 2021 if countries continue to pursue an uncoordinated approach to vaccine distribution. This only weakens our collective ability to ensure peace and stability. For over 20 years now, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, has worked to give the protection of new and underutilized vaccines to more than 800 million children and to support global health security by financing global stockpiles for epidemic diseases such as Ebola, horribly in the news this week again. Our target for the next 5 years is to reach children who receive no routine vaccines, the so-called zero-dose children, 2/3 of whom live below the poverty line, and an estimated 40% living in settlements affected by fragility. Vaccines work against poverty and conflict too, by giving children in particular the same life chances that makes access eligible. Sadly, there is a correlation between conflict and underperformance in immunization. Countries in the Gavi family that are not suffering from fragility reach on average 83% of children with the first dose of vaccine, while countries affected by conflict, this drops to 65%. This is further compounded by challenges to healthcare provision in conflict and fragile settings where access to healthcare and infrastructure are disrupted or restricted where they're needed most, furthering exacerbating the deprivations and inequalities and driving displacement. In response to this, Gavi's fragilities, emergency, and refugees policies provide greater health systems funding and flexibilities to eligible partners and countries. But it isn't just the vaccine. It's also, as Henrietta said, the supply chain, the bravery and professionalism of the health workforce, and the development of humanitarian actors that is totally essentials. After all, vaccines don't deliver themselves. So now let me come to the biggest test of a multilateral system in a generation. As I have long said, epidemics and pandemics are an evolutionary certainty, and vaccines, where they exist, are an essential tool in preventing these and protecting us all from new diseases. They're an essential investment in both national and international security. A health budget is a defense budget, and investing in vaccines for COVID-19 and for other diseases is a fundamental pillar of global health security. Along with securing and supporting populations impacted by conflict, it's important to consider pandemic preparedness, disease and virus surveillance, and security of supply lines, security of health workers and facilities. That is why, as my colleague Henrietta Fore explained, COVAX and its goal for equitable access is so critical to ending the acute phase of the pandemic. And this goes hand in hand with access to diagnostics, therapeutics, supply chains, and health systems innovations. As part of the COVAX facility, a proposed humanitarian buffer will enable access to COVID-19 vaccines for high-risk populations in humanitarian settings, especially where they are at risk of being excluded or where governments and health ministries have no access due to conflict. While we work on this safety net with the strong support of our humanitarian partners in the Interagency Standing Committee, COVAX and our partners are clear that the first resort for covering all the high-risk groups, irrespective of their legal status, is their inclusion in the country's national vaccine plans. The humanitarian buffer is but a measure of last resort. I ask that the UN Security Council to reinforce this message so that available doses are distributed to ensure truly equitable access in accordance with the humanitarian principles and in upholding state obligations towards populations within their territory. COVAX has secured 2.3 billion doses of vaccine in advanced commitments and options for 190 countries in 2021. Of these, at least 1.3 billion doses are reserved, but not fully paid for with donor funding. These doses are meant for 92 lower-income countries eligible for the COVAX advanced market commitment, which could increase to a further 1.8 billion doses that could be delivered with additional financing. Given the new variants, it is clear that we will have to adapt vaccines and strategies, and this may further increase the required cost. It's critical that donors and countries step up with additional funding, that manufacturers prioritize multilateral initiatives over bilateral deals with short-term profit, stop inequitable vaccine diplomacy, that research and development and essential scientific knowledge is shared, and that the family of nations represented by the United Nations pull together and prepare for the largest logistical effort in immunization the world has ever seen. It's also fundamentally important that where the vaccines are available, the Security Council plays its critical role in enabling supplies to move into conflict-affected settings via neutral humanitarian actors in accordance with international law. Mr. President, Excellencies, as an epidemiologist who has specialized in infectious disease epidemiology over a lifetime, as the head of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the COVAX facility, I can say that science tells us there is no way out of this pandemic alone. We have to do it together or face generational consequences. Our ask to the Security Council is that they advocate for and invest in this unprecedented effort, that they call on all nations to ensure the unhindered deployment of vaccines in all settings, including those affected by conflict, and into the arms of all high-risk individuals, refugees, or citizens. As we now know, global health security is key to economic and human security, progress, and stability, and we overlook it at our own peril. No one is safe until we are all safe. COVID-19 is the biggest stress test of the multilateral system we've seen in decades. It has affected every person, every community, every country on Earth. We must get this one right, particularly as it is an evolutionary certainty that this will not be the last pandemic. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barkley, and thank you for the work you're doing and that Gavi is doing. I now give the floor to Mr. Jagan Chapgayan. Over to you.
Please check your microphone. We can't hear you. Are you on mute, please? Check.
Yeah, you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to join this important discussion today. Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, COVID-19 has shown us many things. It has highlighted painfully the weaknesses inherent within our public health systems. It has underlined our interconnectedness and the importance of responding to a global pandemic in a coordinated way. And it has shown the deadly consequences of mistrust. It seems sadly appropriate that I'm speaking to you about trust just days after a new Ebola outbreak was announced in Guinea. The parallels between Ebola and COVID-19, both in terms of the destructive nature of mistrust and transformative capacity of creating trust, are profound. What happened? Couldn't fix it. It was the problem. When communities do not understand health interventions, they will not accept them. Instead, they are likely to see these health measures as threats, which can lead to violence. We saw this many times during the Ebola outbreaks, and we have all seen this many, many times during the COVID-19 pandemic. Put simply, mistrust kills. When science is not only ignored but derided, when the decision to wear masks becomes controversial, and when the wave is filled with absurd rumors, trust in the tremendous efforts to stop the pandemic is severely undermined. When mistrust prevails, it stops people from getting the help they need. It prevents us from ending public health emergencies. It can even lead to people incorrectly blaming others, foreigners, migrants, or other minority groups for the spread of an illness. What can be done? A crisis is not the ideal time to rebuild trust. However, it can be done, but it requires listening and sincerity in acting on what communities tell us. Let me give you an example. Our initial attempts to safely bury Ebola victims in the Democratic Republic of the Congo were met with hostility. So we reached out to communities and we listened. We trained 800 community volunteers to gather community feedback, and we analyzed the results to understand why people were refusing our support. We used what we learned to adapt, both how we handled the burials and how we engaged with communities. And the result of this diligent, patient work was that refusals dropped from 80% to just 8% by the end of the outbreak. Trust has to be earned. It requires seeking out community feedback and constantly adapting our response to address the concerns and fears that periodically flow through communities. It also requires investment, certainly more than has been the case during this pandemic. Mr. President, mistrust has consistently undermined COVID-19 response efforts. Now, as we turn to the immunization phase of the global response, earning community trust remains crucial, especially against the backdrop of historically high levels of vaccine hesitancy. As we learned during Ebola, people trust us for our actions. They look at what we do and they judge us for what we do not do. They see clearly the current high levels of vaccine inequity and inequality. They see the unfairness, for example, in the fact that less than 1% of vaccine doses globally have been administered in the 32 countries facing severe or very severe humanitarian crisis. The fair and equitable distribution of vaccines is essential to building trust and for maintaining international peace and preventing violence. This is about more than fairness. This is about stopping the virus. However, equity is not something that happens on its own. History tells us that. Just as we need to ensure that all countries can access vaccines, we also need to make sure that those vaccines reach the arms of all the people who need them. Underserved, alienated, or isolated communities, including those living in areas not under the control of states, as well as detainees, IDPs, and refugees, must be integrated in national vaccination efforts. Strong involvement of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and other local impartial organizations in vaccination activities can help ensure that these last-mile communities are not left behind. The efforts of the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies to maintain routine immunization in contexts like Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, and Pakistan have saved countless lives. This unparalleled access into last-mile communities can just as easily channel COVID-19 vaccinations while maintaining critical routine vaccinations. The vaccination campaign we launched just last month to help vaccinate 500 million people in support of the global efforts was born out of this reach and the trust of our membership at the most local level. How can you, as UN member states, support these efforts to build trust and integrate last-mile communities into COVID-19 immunization efforts? You can include community organizations such as the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in all phases of immunization planning and delivery. By involving these actors, you will gain insight into community misconceptions and misgivings, and will gain sight of those groups and communities that might normally be hidden from your view. Mr. President, I would like to stress the importance of ensuring the safety and protection of volunteers, first responders, and healthcare workers during this pandemic. In 2020, my colleagues at the International Committee of the Red Cross documented nearly 850 incidents of violence against healthcare workers involved in the COVID-19 response, a figure that is both shocking and almost certainly an underestimate. International humanitarian law must be respected. Violence against healthcare workers must not be tolerated. We have a collective responsibility to care for those who care for us. Mr. President, let me conclude by thanking the millions of volunteers who are serving on the front lines of this pandemic. By selflessly responding to the needs of others, each of them create tiny ripples of hope. I believe that these ripples will build trust and eventually turn into the wave that washes away this pandemic. These volunteers prove that humanity is not only alive, but is in fact thriving, giving us all hope for peace and security as we deal with the toughest crisis of our lifetime. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chapgayan, for your briefing and the work of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. I will now make a statement in my capacity as the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs for the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Your Excellencies, I am very pleased and honoured to address this first ever Security Council meeting on vaccinations. It is, I think, right that we bring the full weight of the Security Council and the wider UN system to bear on ending this appalling pandemic. The virus, we know, is still on the rise globally with the emergence of new, more transmissible variants, which has itself driven increased transmission in most regions, I think it's fair to say. But with vaccines approved and now being rolled back, we've got that opportunity to fight back. And at last, I think we can genuinely say that we see light at the end of the tunnel, or at least a light that is drawing closer to us. But this has to be a global effort. The pandemic isn't under control anywhere until it's under control everywhere. And we need to think of ourselves as a team working together against a common and very deadly enemy. That's the reality of our struggle. No nation is truly safe until we are all safe. In terms of what that means for us, I think it means that we have to work to secure access to vaccines around the world, including in the hardest to reach places, including places of conflict and other types of insecurity. And at present, we know that more than 160 million people worldwide are at risk of being excluded from vaccinations because of instability and conflict. So we've got a real challenge to meet the shortfalls in securing supplies, delivering vaccinations on the ground. There are many challenges to achieving this, from securing comprehensive humanitarian access to managing vaccine storage. And overcoming all of these challenges and the compound challenge that they present will require greater national, regional, and international cooperation. And the UN will play a key coordinating role as we bring those efforts together. Local ceasefires are going to be essential to enable life-saving vaccinations to take place. And they're essential to protect the brave health workers and humanitarian workers working in incredibly challenging conditions in conflict zones, who are striving to deliver that help, that vital life-saving help, to those who need it most. Ceasefires have been used to vaccinate the most vulnerable communities in the past. There's no reason why we can't do this. There's no reason why we can't, with the will that we can muster, come together to overcome the challenges. We've seen it in the past to deliver polio vaccines to children in Afghanistan, just to take one example. Likewise, the suspension, or at least the postponement of routine non-COVID vaccination campaigns during the pandemic, I think is another grave concern for all of us. So the rollout of COVID vaccines shouldn't displace those programs. They have to go hand in hand. On the 1st of July last year, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2532 on fighting COVID-19 in the most vulnerable countries. And further action is needed now by the Council to call for ceasefires specifically to enable COVID vaccines to be carried out in those areas that have been so badly affected by conflict. That's why we're proposing a new resolution for this Council's consideration. The COVAX facility is due to start rolling out vaccines this month, and we're proud to host its launch at the Global Vaccine Summit last June, and we're proud to be one of Gavi's largest donors. We will continue to keep up that support. And by calling for vaccination ceasefires and by calling for COVID-19 vaccination plans to include all high-risk populations, including refugees, this resolution and this Council really has an opportunity to help get vaccines distributed to the most vulnerable communities across the planet. It would help ensure full access for humanitarian and medical personnel. It would help protect them as they go about their challenging work. And so I would just close my remarks on behalf of the UK by urging all members of this Council to support the swift and full adoption of this resolution. Our scientists have done incredible work in developing the vaccine. We must work together now to get those vaccines to the most hard-to-reach communities and the most vulnerable in those hard-to-reach communities. We cannot turn away while those in conflict zones are denied this essential, critical protection from the virus. We in this Council have an opportunity, and I believe we have a moral duty to act. Thank you. And I will now resume my functions as President of the Council, and at this point give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ralph Gonsalves, Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by expressing on behalf of St. Vincent and the Grenadines our appreciation to the United Kingdom for convening today's very pertinent discussion. We also thank the briefers for sharing compelling insights on this very important topic. The number of deaths, the level of economic destruction, and the social dislocations associated with COVID-19 continue to expand globally as new variants of the virus with increased transmissibility threaten to disrupt even the most resilient of societies. Amidst this continuously evolving threat, the question of equitable access to vaccines is of prominent concern. Great concern, one of the major issues in contemporary political economy today. The simple truth is that unless vaccines are made available, affordable, and accessible to all, many vulnerable countries and peoples, including those affected by conflict, would suffer unbearably as the pandemic continues to destroy lives and livelihoods. Greater international cooperation amongst all countries, international financial institutions, and major pharmaceutical companies is clearly required. The United Nations and its specialized agencies, such as the World Health Organization, should maintain a central role in ensuring that vaccines can be administered safely, efficiently, and globally to all persons in high-risk categories and more widely to achieve population immunity. In this regard, we would welcome an enforceable international rules-based compact to deliver vaccines to all who need it. We also reiterate the Caribbean community's CARICOM's call for a global summit in the context of the World Health Organization's Access COVID-19 Tools Accelerator Facilitation Council to discuss equitable access and distribution of vaccines. We in the Caribbean community, CARICOM, are resolved to share with each other on the basis of need whatever quantities of vaccines we receive or procure. Political will, principled engagements, and solidarity among all nations remain crucial elements for overcoming COVID-19. There is a disturbing trend of vaccine nationalism. Some wealthy countries hoard critical medical supplies, including vaccines. Such conduct only prolongs the pandemic. Many too will suffer needlessly if vaccine delivery is determined by a narrow market calculus rather than the social imperative of building immunity everywhere in solidarity with each other. We urge vaccine manufacturers, as a gesture of good faith towards humanity, to work with developing countries to expand production capabilities, hence alleviating the strain on global supply chains. We also call for greater financial support for the COVAX facility to bolster the global inoculation campaign. During this difficult period, the Security Council must continue working in unison with other organs of the United Nations to address systematically the various dimensions of this pandemic. Our delegation remains fully supportive of all efforts to promote a global ceasefire to armed conflicts everywhere. This ceasefire would afford conflict-affected countries the time and space to advance peace processes and would facilitate the sustained delivery of life-saving humanitarian, developmental, and capacity-building assistance. A ceasefire will also ensure that vaccines can be distributed safely to those made most vulnerable by conflict, including internally displaced persons and refugees. Where mandates and capabilities allow, peacekeeping operations could be utilized to assist with the transportation and distribution of vaccines, including providing protection to those designated personnel who administer vaccines. Mr. President, as we approach the one-year anniversary since COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, we must work together urgently and intently to build back better. Equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines must form part of any serious effort to recover sustainably from this pandemic. Let us be reminded of our common promise to humanity under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development of leaving no one behind. No one is safe and no one will be safe until everyone is safe. And immunity can only be achieved when it is collectively composed. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Gonzalez. And I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Wang Yi, State Councillor and Minister for Foreign Affairs of China. You have the floor.
Stronger international solidarity and closer international cooperation for people-centered response to COVID-19. It was an exemplification of the role of the Security Council. Over the past 7 months, more than 180 countries endorsed the Secretary General's appeal for an immediate global ceasefire. Important progress has been achieved in several countries, including Libya and Sudan, contributing to global COVID response. That said, a new wave of pandemic is still raging. Developing countries, especially those in conflicts or affected by humanitarian crisis, face difficult challenges. We must redouble our efforts for continued progress in combating COVID-19 and upholding peace. In this connection, China would like to underscore the following points. First, we should put people front and center and step up international cooperation against the COVID-19. In the face of this pandemic, nothing matters more than the people and nothing is more valuable than human lives. This is a relay race of working together to save lives. It is not a zero-sum game where one's gain means the other's loss. Countries need to replace division with solidarity and keep to the right path of cooperation to tide over this trying time caused by COVID-19. We need to resist prejudice, respect science, and reject disinformation and attempts to politicize the pandemic. In this regard, members of the Security Council must lead by example. Second, we should earnestly implement the Security Council resolution to create an enabling environment for COVID response. Countries in armed conflicts and affected by humanitarian crisis are weak links in this global battle against the COVID-19. They deserve particular attention. Parties to armed conflicts should earnestly abide by Resolution 2532. They must walk away from the battlefield of armed conflicts and join the fight against the coronavirus. It's important to ensure access for humanitarian assistance, especially for women, children, and other disadvantaged groups. The United Nations need to use well the humanitarian pause to carry out mediation and good offices to advance political settlement. China always opposes unilateral sanctions without Security Council's mandate. Under the current circumstances, we urge the relevant countries to show humanitarian spirit and at least suspend their unilateral sanctions and other forceful measures with no grounds in international law. Third, we should reduce vaccine deficit and give stronger assistance to developing countries. Vaccines are powerful weapons to defeat COVID-19. Thanks to the concerted efforts by governments, businesses, and scientists of many countries, COVID vaccines are being developed and produced at record speed. Nonetheless, several problems need to be addressed urgently. The first is the deficit in production capacity. For the vaccines already put into urgent and conditional use, countries should increase supply by boosting domestic production and through international cooperation in forms of commissioned and joint production. The second is the deficit in distribution. As Secretary General Guterrez put it, vaccines are reaching high-income countries quickly, while the world's poorest have none at all. Not only will this result in an immunity divide, but will also widen the development gap. We should come together to reject vaccine nationalism, promote fair and equitable distribution of vaccines, and in particular, make them accessible and affordable for developing countries, including those in conflicts. We must ensure that no country in need of the vaccines is left behind and that no individual waiting for vaccination is neglected. Fourth, we should enhance coordination and give full play to the role of the UN system. The WHO plays a central coordinating role in global actions against the COVID-19. Countries should continue to give stronger political and financial support to the organization, particularly the support needed for it to effectively lead this largest vaccination operation in human history. COVAX provides a crucial channel for developing countries to access vaccines. It should prioritize the needs of developing countries and ensure vaccine supplies for conflict-stricken regions and countries under sanctions. Bilateral actions could form synergy with COVAX. The World Food Programme, UNICEF, and other related agencies should use their global shipping networks to build green channels for developing countries and, in particular, solve the last mile problem for vaccine delivery in Africa. Mr. President, colleagues, President Xi Jinping has announced that Chinese vaccines would be a public good and that China would help realize vaccine accessibility and affordability in developing countries. China has been acting to honor its commitment. China was among the first to join the WHO's Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator initiative. We have actively launched vaccine research and development cooperation with more than 10 countries involving over 100,000 volunteers of 100 plus nationalities. China has joined COVAX and given it strong support. We are making concrete efforts for the equitable distribution of vaccines. At the request of the WHO, China has decided to preliminarily contribute 10 million doses of Chinese vaccines to COVAX to meet the urgent need of developing countries. China has donated vaccines to 53 developing countries, including Palestine, Somalia, Iraq, South Sudan, and Syria in response to their request. China has exported vaccines to 22 countries. In the meantime, China has also been using its strength in industrial chains to help other countries manufacture vaccines in China or locally so as to boost the global production capacity. China has decided to join the UN's Group of Friends initiative to donate COVID-19 vaccines to UN peacekeepers. China's commitment to international vaccine cooperation is not about achieving geopolitical goals or reaping economic benefits or attaching political strains. What concerns us most is to ensure that vaccines become accessible and affordable public goods for people of all countries, namely a people's vaccine. China will work with all parties to step up cooperation on vaccines and COVID-19 preparedness and response to foster a global community of health for all and to secure the ultimate global victory against the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Mr. Wang Yi. And I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Pham Binh Minh, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Vietnam. Sir, over to you.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this timely meeting. And I thank Secretary General Antonio Guterrez and the head of UNICEF, IFRC, and Gavi for their insightful briefings. Mr. President, in a short time span of just over a year, the COVID-19 pandemic has unleashed devastating impacts across continents and in every million lives, 2.4 million lives in over 200 countries and territories. The COVID-19 pandemic has created the worst economic and social crisis in decades. It has exposed structural inequalities at global and national levels. It has subjected millions more to poverty and hunger and to the lack of adequate health care. And nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in conflict-ridden countries and regions. Vaccines for COVID-19 has been developed in record time, thanks importantly to global collaboration. It is very important that we, as the global community, continue to work together to make sure that safe and effective vaccines can truly help us curb the spread of COVID-19 and defeat the virus eventually. As time is of the essence, we must act fast, and we need a strategy to win. Such a strategy, in my view, should include at least 3 elements. First is to consider vaccines global public goods that should be made available and affordable to all countries and all communities, with priority given to high-risk populations and those in the front lines in the fight against this pandemic. It is of concern that some countries are stockpiling on vaccines in quantities larger than the population at the expense of poorer countries. But as recent studies have shown, This would be more costly compared to investment into multilateral vaccination efforts like COVAX. Vietnam calls for greater contributions to the COVAX facility to enable broader distributions of COVID-19 vaccines to the developing world, including populations in conflict and fragile settings. Secondly, an environment of peace, security, and stability is critical to ensuring the unhindered delivery of vaccines to those in need. It is also vital to protect infrastructure that are critical to the survival of the civilian populations in general, and for the safe and effective delivery of vaccines in conflict settings. The Council must strengthen the implementations of Resolution 2532. It must, in particular, reiterate its demand for global and extends its goal for a durable humanitarian pause. These are important prerequisites for actors on the ground, including relevant parts of the United Nations system, to effectively assist the delivery of vaccines and the implementations of vaccination campaigns. And thirdly, we must look beyond vaccines and the pandemic itself. We must work to address the root causes of conflicts and fragilities, as well as the inequalities and injustice exposed by this pandemic. The international community must engage in a global multilateral effort led by the United Nations to help build stronger and more resilient health systems and to leverage development assistance, global trade, and economic cooperation so that every country can achieve an inclusive and resilient recovery in the aftermath of this pandemic. Above all, Mr. President, we need a renewed global solidarity and partnership and synergy in our actions. The critical role of the multilateral system with the United Nations at the center cannot be overstated in coordinating global efforts. Also, regional organizations with their respective mandates and advantages can complement international efforts to promote global governance for international peace, stability, and prosperity. Vietnam, as a member of ASEAN and the Security Council, we spare no effort to strengthen multilateral actions in our joint efforts to roll out COVID-19 vaccines and overcome this devastating pandemic. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Mr. Pham. Thank you for your contribution. And I now turn to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Othman Jarandi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Tunisia. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me at the outset to congratulate the United Kingdom for choosing this major topic as one of the signatories events of its Security Council presidency for the month of February. Allow me also to thank Mr. Secretary General and the distinguished briefers for their enlightening contributions on ways and means to secure equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. The UN, UNICEF, IFRC, and Gavi remain, with the WHO, of course, in the forefront of the international community's effort to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic in our people, and we are confident that you will lead all our collective endeavors for equality in the vaccinations effort. Tunisia expressed as early as March 2020 its concern regarding the unprecedented pandemic when President of the Republic, Kais Saied, alerted the Security Council and the UN on the impact of the pandemic on international peace and security. Tunisia and France have then succeeded in introducing and unanimously adopted by the Security Council Resolution 2532, which is a message of hope to the world. In this resolution, the Security Council, considering that the fight against the pandemic requires a strengthening of national, regional, and international cooperation and solidarity, as well as coordinating inclusive, comprehensive, and global international action, call for a cessation of hostilities in various conflicts around the world to facilitate the fight against the pandemic, demands a general and immediate cessation of hostilities in all situations. Through this initiative, we aim at placing the human being at the center of all our actions, contributing to the entrenchment of the culture of human solidarity and collective security, and paving the way for the international community to have new mechanisms capable of strengthening international cooperation and consolidating international peace and security in all their expressions and manifestations. And in this case, to face in tight rows and efficiently the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. President, the worldwide repercussions of the COVID pandemic continue to worsen at all levels, including on international peace and security, with more than 2.3 million deaths and nearly 1.8 million infections, economic contraction, sharp declines in growth levels, heavy production losses, and huge social impacts caused by high unemployment and widespread poverty. The pandemic threatens the stability and continuity of states and will undoubtedly continue for years to impact most severely developing countries, fragile contexts, conflict zones, refugees camps, and displaced person communities, where the lives of millions are at risk of famine and epidemic, especially with the emergence of its new rapidly spreading strains in the absence of health facilities. In the midst of this delicate and unprecedented international situations, the introduction of COVID-19 vaccine is an important step towards containment and control, opening a new window of hope for humanity with the possibility of ending the loss of life and restoring people's livelihood. Tunisia has, despite the stringent economic and social conditions that the country is experiencing, like other countries around the world, supported without any hesitations the African Medical Supplies Platform, launched to raise funds to support the means of control and enable Africans to better cope with the pandemic. We contributed more than $500,000 to the African Union Fund dedicated to the fight against the COVID-19, including plans to acquire sufficient quantities of doses of vaccine for the benefit of African populations. We, therefore, believe in the vital importance of activating international cooperation and solidarity in order to ensure equitable access to vaccine. In this context, Tunisia commends the COVAX initiative for equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines and salutes Gavi and WHO efforts to accelerate development, production, and equal distribution of testing, treatments, and vaccines. This is a unique example of multilateralism and international cooperation to meet the challenges we face. Mr. President, all these efforts would fall short from our Charter's noble goals and principles if we don't translate into reality our shared commitment to make vaccines a global common good. By adopting the SDGs, we all promised to leave no one behind. The first step on this path can only be an equal and affordable access to vaccines for all. And to conclude, Mr. President, let me stress on what Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations already said: no one is safe from COVID until we are all safe. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Durandi, for your contribution. And I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Antony J. Blinken, Secretary of State for the United States. Over to you, sir.
Dominic, thank you very much, and it's very good to be with all of you today. I thank my colleague from Tunisia for his very strong remarks, and I very much thank Secretary General Guterres for his leadership on what is truly a global challenge. Mr. Rob, thank you for bringing us together in particular to look at barriers to vaccine access, including in areas that are affected by conflict. We all know, we all feel that this pandemic has taken a terrible toll on so many families and communities. And first and foremost, as human beings, our hearts go out to all of them. Thanks to tireless global efforts of scientists, of doctors, health professionals, several safe and effective vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics have been developed. And these are remarkable achievements. Thanks to collaboration between the private sector and governments, global manufacturing capacity for safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines is expanding, but not fast enough to address the global need. The United States will work with our partners across the globe to expand manufacturing and distribution capacity and to increase access, including to marginalized populations. Here's how else we plan to contribute to ending this pandemic. As some of you will have seen, President Biden's first national security memorandum made clear that the United States will once again serve as a global health leader. The United States believes that multilateralism, the United Nations, the World Health Organization are essential, not just as an effective international COVID-19 health and humanitarian response, but also building stronger global health capacity and security for the future. We have the immediate challenge of COVID-19. We have a longer challenge, but equally vital in establishing the strongest possible global health structure going forward. With the news of another Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Guinea, there is clearly no time to waste. And our vision has to be bold. We must defeat COVID-19 and prevent future pandemics. To that end, we'll work with partners around the globe to strengthen and reform the WHO, to support the global health security agenda, to build sustainable preparedness for biological threats, to create a warning system that will allow us to respond more rapidly with testing, with tracing, with PPE needed to save lives. We seek to advance the creation of a long overdue sustainable financing mechanism for health security so we can leave the world more prepared for future outbreaks than it was for this pandemic. We're working with the WHO, the COVID-19 Vaccine Global Access Facility, and the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. And we recently elevated our participation from observer to participant on the ACT Facilitation Council. We plan to provide significant financial support to COVAX through Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and we'll work to strengthen other multilateral initiatives involved in the global COVID-19 response. For example, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations and the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. These commitments build on a long tradition. Over the past 2 decades, the United States has provided more than $140 billion in global health assistance. We're now the single largest contributor to the international response to COVID-19. Today, I'm pleased to confirm that by the end of the month, the United States intends to pay over $200 million in assessed and current obligations to the WHO. This is a key step forward in fulfilling our financial obligations as a WHO member. And it reflects our renewed commitment to ensuring the WHO has the support it needs to lead the global response to the pandemic, even as we work to reform it for the future. Every country needs to do its part and contribute to the COVID-19 response. We've already announced more than $1.6 billion in emergency economic, health, and humanitarian aid to try to help governments, international organizations, and NGOs mitigate the effects of COVID-19 and its secondary impacts worldwide. And that's in addition to a commitment of $1.16 billion over fiscal years 2020 through 2023 to support Gavi's broader immunization efforts. As we move forward, it's critical to look at who the pandemic has hurt the most. The Secretary General has called for us to put women and girls at the center of the COVID-19 response and recovery. The data we've all seen has shown a profound backsliding in gender equality, including spikes in gender-based violence as families are confined to close quarters during the pandemic. We need to continue implementing Security Council Resolution 1325 and redouble our efforts to implement Council Resolution 2475. We must support the Secretary General's various COVID-19 policy briefs on gender, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable and marginalized groups. These groups must be included as decision makers at all levels, following the principle of nothing about us without us. And countries must be held accountable for upholding their human rights obligations. No country should be allowed to use COVID-19 as an excuse to violate human rights or fundamental freedoms. We also call for all countries to combat misinformation on vaccines. If we don't, we seriously jeopardize our mission. Even as we expand access to safe and effective vaccines, we know that COVID-19 outbreaks are likely to occur in the years to come. The ongoing expert investigation about the origins of this pandemic and the report that will be issued must be independent, with findings based on science and facts, and free from interference. To better understand this pandemic and prepare for the next one, all countries must make available all data from the earliest days of any outbreak. And going forward, all countries should participate in a transparent and robust process for preventing and responding to health emergencies, so the world learns as much as possible as soon as possible. Transparency, information sharing, access for international experts. These must be the hallmarks of our common approach to what is truly a global challenge. The language in Resolution 2532 remains as relevant now as when it was adopted in July of 2020. Conflict-affected countries, weakened by war, violence, and poor health infrastructure, remain highly vulnerable to pandemics and other illnesses that can be prevented by immunizations. And this pandemic has worsened already dire humanitarian and political crises, contributing to unprecedented levels of need. Organizing and implementing mass vaccination campaigns amid violence and conflict, we know, will be immensely difficult. But we have to do it to prevent humanitarian crises from getting worse and to stop the pandemic's secondary impacts from degrading fragile political situations. As President Biden has made clear, the United States will work as a partner to address global challenges. This pandemic is one of those challenges, and it gives us an opportunity not only to get through the current crisis, but also to become more prepared and more resilient for the future. Thank you, and I'm grateful to be able to work with all of you on the challenge that affects all of us.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Secretary of State. Thank you for that contribution. And I now turn to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, Minister for External Affairs of India. The floor is yours, sir.
Mr. President, Foreign Secretary Raab, let me begin by thanking the United Kingdom for organizing this discussion today. I also appreciate the insightful briefings on the challenges that we are confronted with regarding the availability, accessibility, affordability, and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines in conflict-affected regions. As we assess the impact of the pandemic and the prospects of recovery, including through the availability of vaccines, there are 5 concerns that India would like to share. 1, lack of global coordination regarding vaccine distribution will hit conflict-affected areas and poorer countries hardest. The ICRC estimates that more than 60 million people in such areas are at risk. 2, there currently exists a glaring disparity in accessibility of vaccines globally. Equity in access to vaccines is important for mitigating the impact of the pandemic. 3, this disparity calls for cooperation within the framework of COVAX, which is trying to secure adequate vaccine doses for the world's poorest nations. 4, from an economic standpoint, the costs of inequitable vaccine distribution are truly massive. The International Chamber of Commerce predicts that the global economy stands to lose as much as $9.2 trillion if the international community fails to address vaccine inequity. And 5, routine immunization programs have been thrown into disarray. Due to the pandemic, about 80 million children in at least 68 countries are at risk of diphtheria, measles, and polio. Mr. President, in order for the world to put the COVID-19 pandemic decisively behind us and to emerge more resilient, I would like to put forward the following 9 points for our collective consideration. 1, persist with the vaccination drive along with other public health measures to slow down the virus's ability to infect new people and mutate further. 2, collaborate with each other on genomic surveillance to track virus mutations and variants and exchange information in this regard in a regular and timely fashion. 3, effectively address public resistance to vaccines. Vaccine-related information must be contextual, empathetic, and culturally sensitive, while providing scientific and accurate facts to allay the fears and concerns of the public. 4, improve public health infrastructure and build capacity through effective training programs in vaccine delivery, especially in areas where health infrastructure is weak. 5, stop vaccine nationalism. Indeed, actively encourage internationalism. Hoarding superfluous doses will defeat our efforts towards attaining collective health security. 6, strengthen the COVAX facility to ensure equitable distribution of vaccines to all in a fair and equitable manner. 7, urgently resume immunization programs across the world before children's lives are threatened by other diseases. We simply cannot trade one health crisis for another. 8, stop disinformation campaigns taking advantage of this pandemic to advance their nefarious objectives and activities. And 9, proactively prepare for the next global pandemic by focusing on improving capacities, developing protocols, and building a knowledge base and expertise. Mr. President, India has been very much at the forefront of this global fight against COVID-19 pandemic. We had earlier provided critical medicines, diagnostic kits, ventilators, and PPEs to more than 150 countries, about 80 of them on a ground basis. Today, the pharmacy of the world is stepping forward to meet the global vaccines challenge. 2 vaccines, including one indigenously developed, have already been granted emergency authorization. Additionally, as many as 30 candidates are under various stages of development. In one of the largest vaccination drives ever, India itself will vaccinate about 300 million frontline and healthcare workers, elderly and vulnerable over the next 6 months. Our vaccination program, which has begun a month ago, has already seen nearly 7 million people vaccinated. Under the initiative of Vaccine Maitri, which translates into vaccine friendship, India provides vaccines to the world. We are, of course, a significant source of supply to the COVAX facility. But in addition, India is also directly sending vaccines to our friends and partners. Starting with our immediate neighbors, 25 nations across the world have already received Made in India vaccines. 49 more countries will be supplied in the coming days, ranging from Europe, North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, to Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Keeping in mind the UN peacekeepers who operate in such difficult circumstances, we would like to announce today a gift of 200,000 doses for them as well. We are working actively with Gavi, WHO, and ACT Accelerator. Our contribution has also supported the SARC COVID-19 Emergency Fund. Mr. President, the Bhagavad Gita states, do your work with the welfare of others always in mind. That is the spirit in which India approaches the COVID challenge and urges this Council to work collectively to address its different dimensions. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaishankar, for your contribution and your announcement. I now turn to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Eva Maria Limets, Minister of Foreign Affairs for Estonia. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. President, distinguished briefers, dear colleagues, let me first express my sympathy and solidarity with all the people and nations of the world suffering from the coronavirus. It's almost a year since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. New, more transmissible coronavirus variants indicate that the crisis will last longer than expected. Therefore, we must make sure that no one is left behind by vaccination programs. Therefore, I wish to thank the United Kingdom for convening today's very relevant and timely debate. There are three aspects that Estonia would like to highlight today. First, ensuring unhindered humanitarian access to conflict areas is vital. Enabling full, safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance remains crucial for the delivery of the COVID-19 vaccines. It is equally important that other immunization programs would not get sidelined due to the global attention to coronavirus. In this regard, I reiterate Estonia's unwavering support to Secretary General's call for global ceasefire. Let me also stress that it is unacceptable how coronavirus is being used as a pretext for trying to lift restrictive measures. Both EU and United Nations sanctions include the possibility of humanitarian exemptions and to not obstruct the fight against the pandemic. Secondly, multilateral response is the only way out of the global crisis. Investment in vaccines and securing their delivery in fragile environments is not only moral, but also a very practical step. We will not be able to restore international trade, travel, prosperity, and security until COVID-19 is under control everywhere in the world. The European Union has been at the forefront of the multilateral response in the field of global and equitable access to vaccines, tests, and treatments. Estonia remains committed to equal and fair distribution of vaccines globally. As a manifestation of our solidarity, we have made a pledge to the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment to support access to vaccines to those most vulnerable. We are ready to further discuss how we can help. We must also address the so-called infodemic that continues to undermine our joint global response. To overcome the virus, we need to promote facts and science-based information and avoid manipulating with information. Protection of human rights, including freedom of expression, is equally critical for the response and recovery from the pandemic. We condemn all attempts of using COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext for disrespecting the rule of law, curtailing human rights, restricting civic space. We must secure free, independent, and pluralistic media, both online and offline. Third, we must make use of full potential of digital technologies to overcome the crisis everywhere. As the world continues its fight against COVID-19, our reliance on technology has increased. Many of our everyday functions and operations have moved online. It is therefore all the more pressing that we protect our essential infrastructure from cyber threats. Unfortunately, we have seen vaccine producers and those involved in vaccine distribution targeted by cyber criminals, while the sole focus should be on delivering the vaccines. Holding the perpetrators accountable and working together towards a more stable and secure cyberspace is the best way to resist the efforts of malicious cyber actors. Cybersecurity and applicability of existing international law in cyberspace are also amongst the issues that Estonia is raising awareness around in the Security Council. Dear colleagues, building on 20 years of experience in developing a secure and trusted digital governance infrastructure, Estonia is undertaking a global public health collaboration with the World Health Organization. The first step is to build a pilot and interoperability framework, a global trust framework for smart vaccination certificates. We trust it will become a significant piece of global digital public good, enabling WHO to build any kind of cross-border digital health data services in the future. To allow the validation of vaccinations, a secure and privacy-preserving smart vaccination certificate solution has been developed in Estonia that could be put into use also in more fragile and complex environments. To conclude with, the current crisis and past pandemics have shown that it takes a coordinated global effort to roll back a global suffering. If COVID-19 is left to ravage those with weaker healthcare system or population groups in conflict situations, the virus will soon spread back to other countries. This is the reality. We are only as strong as the weakest link in the global health system. So thank you for today's debate.
So much, Your Excellency, for that contribution. I now turn to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Marcelo Ebrard Casobon, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Mexico. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias al Reino.
Thank you very much to the United Kingdom for convening this debate. And I'd like to thank Dominic Raab for convening us together today to discuss this, and I welcome everyone else. As we have heard, COVID-19 has had a devastating social and economic impact, but particularly on poor people. It not only threatens reversing achievements, it has indeed reversed what we have achieved in development and peace building as an international community, and it could further exacerbate conflicts as well. According to figures recently published, the regular vaccination campaigns have been suspended in 45 countries experiencing humanitarian crises. And as a result of this context, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected millions of people, including vulnerable refugees and migrants, and particularly women and children. We've also seen an increase in gender-based violence. Women are the ones that have been most affected by the crisis. And that's why Mexico, like many countries, has indicated that the only way to address this pandemic is through cooperation and multilateralism. This form of coordinated and shared work is fundamental. And although in the past it's been important, today it's essential that we do this. The Community of Latin American and Caribbean states, and we hold the rotating presidency at the moment, appreciates the urgent need to implement the provisions of Resolution 74274 of the General Assembly, calling for a strengthening of supply systems to promote universal, just, equitable, and timely access to vaccines in order to confront the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly, the COVAX multilateral mechanism is an important tool in order to, it's extraordinary, in fact, to achieve our goals. But we also have to recognize that its results have been insufficient until now. And the situation that we wanted to avoid, unfortunately, is coming into being. We have not yet seen distribution of enough vaccines according to these multilateral mechanisms. This is why we call upon countries to avoid undue hoarding of vaccines and to speed up the first stages of COVAX delivery and give priority to countries that have the least resources. We'd also point out that it's also been pointed out that these countries won't have generalized access until the middle of 2023 if current trends are maintained. According to data of the Executive Director of the WHO, and these figures are alarming, 3/4 of the initial 128 million doses in the world are concentrated in 10 countries, and those 10 countries represent 60% of global GDP. Conservative estimates suggest that there are more than 100,000 countries where there has not yet been a single dose of vaccine applied, or perhaps just a symbolic application. There are many things as part of this process, but what we are seeing today is a huge gap opening up between the small group of countries that I mentioned and the majority of the international community, the other countries that don't have sufficient access to vaccines. In fact, I don't think we've ever seen such a huge division affecting so many in such a short space of time. And this is why this meeting is so important, to reverse this injustice that is happening, because the security of humanity as a whole depends on this. And that's why we call upon the international community to avoid establishing mechanisms that could prevent the speedy distribution of vaccines, and that we should strengthen the supply chains that will promote and guarantee universal access. We reaffirm our support to the World Health Organization as coordinator for multilateral efforts to confront the pandemic. And as part of the actions that Mexico has been taken to respond to the current crisis, and with the help of the Mexican private sector, we, together with Argentina, concluded an agreement with AstraZeneca to produce and bottle the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine in our region and make it available to countries in the region. Mexico is one of the few countries that has access to the vaccine. Thank you to everyone, India, China, and others, but we have to think about everyone, and if we have more possibilities, we must consider others. And I would, on behalf of CELAC, suggest that we speed up COVAX and stop this monopolization of vaccines. Mr. President, I think that the measures that should be proposed should recognize, first of all, that the Security Council can and should play an active and decisive role so that this goal that I have just described can be achieved. We must reaffirm our support for the implementation of Resolution 2532, and in that respect, strengthen support for the call of the Secretary General in favor of a global ceasefire in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's also true that we have to put women and young people at the heart of our concerns. And in conclusion, we must ensure that we provide universal, free, timely access to all countries to vaccines, according to Resolution 74274. This is the situation we face, but we won't solve it unless we resolve this through multilateralism, the multilateralism of our times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for that contribution. And now I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Ina Eriksen Søreide, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Norway. Ina, you have the floor.
President, first of all, I would like to thank you personally, Dominic, for your engagement, and the UK for organizing this very important debate. I would also like to thank the briefers The COVID-19 pandemic has really been a stress test of national and global health systems and our systems of governance. And it has led to the loss of more than 2 million lives and disrupted billions more. And now it's imperative that we as an international community and as the Security Council forge a united way forward. So I will focus my remarks on 3 key challenges where Norway encourages targeted action. First, we have to ensure equitable global access to COVID-19 vaccines. We see newly developed vaccines are being distributed as we speak. This is promising, but so far most of the vaccines have been made available to people in just a few high-income countries. We have to make vaccines available for all, including in areas affected by conflict and insecurity. The ACT-A partnership and its COVAX facility are the fundamentals in ensuring that all countries are included in our common fight to stop the pandemic. And as many of you know, Norway fully supports the important work of Gavi, CEPI, and the WHO in this effort. And we are proud to co-chair the Facilitation Council of the ACT Accelerator together with South Africa. The COVAX humanitarian buffer will be vital to be able to reach people living in contested areas or areas beyond the reach of national health authorities. That includes internally displaced persons, refugees, and migrants. Norway has so far contributed around $500 million to the ACT-A pillars alone with a focus on COVAX. And I strongly encourage more countries to contribute and to help close the COVAX funding gap. My second point is full and unimpeded humanitarian access that is essential for vaccines to reach the most vulnerable groups. In situations of armed conflict, all parties must fully respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. And attacks on medical facilities and personnel are unacceptable. Patients, health workers, and facilities have to be protected, and Security Council Resolution 2066 must be implemented. Women are being disproportionately affected, and they make up 70% of health and social care workers, and they are at the forefront of information dissemination to local communities. And this puts women at the heart of COVID-19 response, not least in the areas hardest hit by conflict and crisis. Norway relies on the WHO to lead and to coordinate the response to the crisis. Key humanitarian partners such as the WFP, UNHCR, UNICEF, WHO, and OCHA, they need flexible funding to respond to the many severe and rapidly changing consequences of the pandemic. And as for Norway, we have significantly increased our flexible humanitarian support. The Red Cross and Red Crescent societies play a crucial role in rolling out life-saving vaccination programs under these very challenging circumstances. My third point, hostilities must cease in order to allow vaccination to take place in conflict areas. We have to be ready to engage with all parties. In many conflict areas, civilians and combatants are living in territories controlled or contested by non-state armed groups. And reaching these populations may involve engaging with actors whose behavior we condemn. The successful dialogues with armed groups in Afghanistan, in Syria, and elsewhere to allow humanitarian access for polio and other health campaigns, they offer lessons for the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines. Norway will continue to support Secretary General Guterres' call for global ceasefire. We approach the parties in Colombia and the Philippines on the basis of Guterres' call. They deserve credit for implementing humanitarian ceasefires. Political commitments, clear parameters, transparency, and monitoring mechanisms are necessary, both to achieve ceasefire and to allow successful rollout of vaccines. President, dear Dominic, UN special representatives, envoys, and missions have adjusted their efforts to this changing reality. The UN system has shown its ability to respond quickly and effectively to the pandemic on several fronts. From Idlib to Gaza, from Menaka to Tigray, it is our duty as a Security Council to keep a close eye on these shifting dynamics, to coordinate efforts, and to facilitate full and unimpeded humanitarian access, as well as peaceful resolution of conflicts. We must call for concerted action across all pillars and institutions of the UN to secure the widest and most equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. This is how we can ensure that no one is left behind. Thank you, Dominic.
Ina, thank you very much. I now turn to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Simon Coveney, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence of Ireland. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dominic. Mr. President, I'd like to congratulate, first of all, the United Kingdom on its presidency of the Council, and also to thank you, Dominic, for convening this important debate. I'd also like to thank Secretary General Guterrez and the briefers for their input and your contribution, Dominic, in your opening remarks, which I think have very much framed our deliberations today. The Security Council, in Resolution 2532, endorsed Secretary General Guterrez's call for a global ceasefire and durable humanitarian pause to help us tackle COVID and reach those most in need. And I strongly echo those calls today. COVID-19 has brought humanity to a crossroads in many ways. How we travel from here will have far-reaching implications for peace and security, for global equality, and for the sustainability of our shared future. In the effort to beat this virus, I'm reminded of an Irish proverb which says, "There is no strength without unity." Perhaps we should update that in the context of the pandemic to "none of us are safe until all of us are safe," which is a message that I think has been repeated by speaker after speaker today. For us all to be safe, all countries must be able to vaccinate their own people. And all populations must be included in national vaccination rollouts, including refugees and internally displaced persons. We need to be more ambitious in scaling up the availability of vaccines in conflict-affected zones and in financing the necessary delivery modalities while avoiding diverting funds from existing crises. Parties to conflicts must draw on their own principles of humanity as well as their obligations under international humanitarian law to facilitate humanitarian access, uphold ceasefires, and implement pauses in fighting to enable medical humanitarian teams to undertake their vital functions, including safely delivering COVID-19 vaccinations to those who need it most. Whether in Yemen, in Syria, in the Central African Republic, or Ethiopia, COVID-19 has exacerbated the devastation that conflict wreaks on civilian life. Globally, the risks for long-term prosperity and stability are obvious. From the 270 million facing food insecurity today to the 20 million girls who will not return to education. Hunger will also act as a push factor for forced migration, displacement, and of recruitment by extremist groups, driving on conflict in many forms and deepening humanitarian need. Ireland's fully committed to efforts by the UN system to establish a fair, a transparent, and efficient mechanism for equitable COVID-19 vaccine distribution and supply. In this regard, Ireland has increased our core support for Gavi significantly this year. Ireland attaches high priority to global health, in which we plan to invest over 50 million euros in 2021 alone. We're also supporting the COVAX facility bilaterally and the European Union, which to date has contributed 860 million euro to the facility so far. COVAX, with its humanitarian buffer, is a crucial aspect of the multilateral response against a global threat, and has the potential to embody multilateral solidarity at its best. However, more resources are needed to enable COVAX to fulfill its mandate, including the financing of delivery mechanisms for NGO partners who are best placed to reach the most vulnerable populations in conflict contexts. When it comes to vaccinations, We aren't starting from zero, and we can learn valuable lessons from pre-vaccination campaigns in fragile contexts, building on the vast experience of national governments and stakeholders, including the WHO, Gavi, the Global Fund, and many others. We must tackle misinformation and disinformation by providing clear and evidence-based information on the benefits of immunization to the public. We must also address the challenge of vaccine hesitancy, taking a sensitive approach that is rooted in community leadership and engagement. There are other challenges that will need to be addressed as we move forward. The most important of these is the need to strengthen wider public health ecosystems, especially in conflict settings where the challenges are well known. This is why Ireland has put investment into healthcare systems at the heart of its development cooperation programme for more than 2 decades, working with partner governments, particularly in Africa, to strengthen domestic healthcare capacity and build robust health systems. Healthcare workers are at the heart of the healthcare systems. Sufficient healthcare professionals, trained and enabled to prevent virus transmission, carry out case detection and provide early response care will be needed to ensure successful vaccine rollout. There are also important vaccine logistical requirements to attend to, such as cold chain requirements, access to power and database management capabilities to ensure appropriate follow-up. Ensuring that developing countries can access vaccines appropriate for their contexts, especially for fragile contexts, will also be key. So only by ensuring these necessary conditions are in place can we ensure that vaccination in conflict settings can be successful. Failure to manage this effectively in many ways is unthinkable. It runs the risk of further loss of life, exacerbating local conflicts, wasting precious vaccine resources, and placing strain on the humanitarian system, which may hinder its ability to provide other urgent life-saving support. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the vulnerabilities of all of our societies to unforeseen threats and challenges. It has shown how a collective international response that mobilizes the best of humanity in science, research, and assistance can point to a much brighter future. We approach the fight against COVID in the way we approach many other challenges in that this Council addresses, by looking for ways to overcome division, pursue common solutions, and find ways to help those most in need. We will, of course, remain strongly supportive of all efforts by this Council to provide global leadership on this issue and others. Thank you, President.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Thank you, Simon, for that contribution. And now I will turn to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Frank Riester, Minister Delegate for Foreign Trade and Economic Attractiveness for France. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President of the Security Council. Ladies and gentlemen, ministers, at the outset, I would like to thank the United Kingdom for organising this meeting. I also thank Secretary General Henrietta Fore, Seth Berkley, and Yagan Chapagain for their presentations. The adoption on the 1st of July 2020 of Resolution 2532 upon the initiative of France and Tunisia was an important landmark in our mobilisation against the COVID-19 pandemic. We must continue these efforts. In this regard, I should like to recall that the cessation of hostilities is an indispensable condition to effectively combat the pandemic. Whilst there has been some progress, we have also seen that the situation remains very unstable in some countries. I would like to commend the remarkable work of the Blue Helmets in extremely difficult conditions. We must more than ever support peacekeeping operations. We must also think about how to include peacekeeping personnel in vaccination strategies. Safe and unimpeded humanitarian access is also necessary to facilitate the rollout of vaccination campaigns against COVID-19. The pandemic has been accompanied by an increase in attacks against humanitarian and medical personnel, which is unacceptable. The perpetrators of these crimes must be brought to justice. Today's meeting must also be an opportunity to highlight international solidarity in the global fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a sine qua non for an effective response to the crisis. For France, the COVID-19 vaccination must be considered as a global public good so as to ensure universal, equitable access to this vaccine, as the international community reaffirmed during the last Global Health Assembly. Support for health multilateralism is crucial to prevail over the pandemic. We must reaffirm the central role of the WHO, the only universal health organization, in managing this crisis. We must also lend our full support to the Act A initiative, which France spearheaded with the WHO and the European Commission, so as to foster development, production, and equitable universal access to tools to combat COVID-19. This is why we support the British initiative of a Security Council resolution. Global access to the vaccine will be a test for a new multilateralism, bringing together both states and businesses. We must encourage production partnerships between businesses so as to prevent vaccine shortages wherever possible. We must also guarantee that the vaccines are safe and effective, validated by competent, recognized regulatory authorities whose approval process guarantees their effectiveness. We must also guarantee that the products are safe. The WHO plays this role when some states do not have the necessary expertise. The COVAX facility has been mobilized to meet needs. This facility within the Act A is steered by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, in cooperation with the WHO. The COVAX facility has been supported by France and the European Union since its inception, and for 2021 it has secured access for 92 low and middle income countries to 1.7 billion doses, out of a total of 2.3 billion doses for 191 countries. This mechanism will allow a guarantee of fair allocation of safe vaccines, which will be administered according to WHO recommendations. Access to the vaccine must happen upon the basis of a legitimate framework defined by the WHO and not according to the law of the jungle. This is why the European Union supports COVAX and is contributing €853 million to it. This issue of solidarity and equitable universal access is at the heart of the Charter for Equitable Access to COVID-19 Health Products, which France promotes and which was adopted by the members of the Act A Council on the 9th of February. The COVAX facility also takes into account the difficulties faced by conflict zones by securing doses within a humanitarian reserve. France also wishes to step up international solidarity in access to the COVID-19 vaccine by setting up a community mechanism of donated vaccines alongside its European Union partners. Finally, we must step up our efforts to bolster health systems in the most fragile states, particularly in Africa. Without resilient health systems, which allow us to maintain and improve effective access to high-quality health services, we cannot combat this virus. France is mobilized particularly through bilateral health aid, which it provides to African countries affected by the pandemic. More than ever, we must support the multilateral system with the United Nations at its forefront, so that the global response to the health crisis happens upon the basis of values which are at the heart of the international system: international solidarity, cooperation, and responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Mr. Reister, for your statement. Can I now turn to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Rachel Omamo, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs for Kenya. The floor is yours, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellencies, may I immediately begin by congratulating Dominic on the assumption of the United Kingdom to the presidency for the month of February. I also commend you for including in your program of work this timely briefing that affords us the opportunity to consider the role of this Council and the United Nations at large in ensuring equitable, affordable, and timely access to COVID-19 vaccines, particularly in contexts affected by conflict and security. Our appreciation also goes out to the Secretary General and to our very competent briefers. Mr. President, the COVID-19 pandemic has thrust upon the world an unprecedented health, socio-economic, and security challenge that continues to unfold. Implications of the pandemic are particularly serious for the African continent, in which a number of zones of fragility and conflict exist, and where other pervasive health challenges, such as HIV/AIDS, malaria, Ebola, continue to plague our populations. The COVID-19 pandemic has strained humanitarian aid flows, exposed vulnerable groups such as women and children in conflict areas to further risks. It has eroded peace-building initiatives and threatens to reverse critical development gains made by countries in transition or those undergoing post-conflict reconstruction. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic is more than a health crisis. It is an existential challenge to global human and economic development and an acute threat to global peace and security. The pandemic therefore demands that this Council leads the way in articulating a human security-based approach to the vexing issues surrounding equitable access to coronavirus vaccines. A new urgency is required to mobilize global responsibility and action to protect lives. I salute the immense efforts made by the international community in the development of COVID-19 vaccines. However, this optimism is threatened by significant realities which perpetuate inequality and exclusion in our world. These include the prohibitive costs of vaccines, limited vaccine supplies and manufacturing deficiencies, increased export restrictions on vaccines and their ingredients, the emergence of viral mutations, and the erosion of global solidarity through the hoarding of vaccines, together with vaccine nationalism and opaque bilateral vaccines deals. My delegation therefore welcomes the role of COVAX, this facility that is multilateral in nature and which facilitates the rapid and fair distribution of coronavirus vaccines. It is gratifying that up to 5% of the COVAX doses are reserved as part of a humanitarian buffer to be used for missed or neglected populations such as refugees and asylum seekers. We would urge the extension of this element of the facility to populations affected by conflict and insecurity. To further facilitate equitable and timely access to vaccines, which we view as a global public good, there is an urgent need to democratize and scale up local production and manufacturing capability, especially on the African continent, through partnerships, technology transfer, and the suspension of barriers related to intellectual property. We therefore reiterate our support for the African Union's Assembly decision made at its 34th ordinary session on the 7th of February 2021, calling for the temporary waiver of certain TRIPS agreements obligations for the prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19. Mr. President, along with these proposals and with a view to facilitating vaccine delivery in fragile and conflict-affected regions, we believe that the Security Council should, first, renew its demand under Resolution 2532 for a general and immediate cessation of hostilities in all situations on its agenda, and call upon all parties in armed conflicts to engage immediately in a durable humanitarian pause. Second, incorporate humanitarian curve-outs in its sanctions regime for this purpose. Thirdly, mandate its field operations, including peace support operation missions, to facilitate the safe delivery of vaccines, assist local communities in sensitization regarding vaccines, and also ensure the timely vaccination of peacekeepers and UN humanitarian personnel in the field. Fourth, call for increased financial support to the COVAX facility, as well as increased support to countries experiencing conflict and those hosting large populations of refugees. In closing, Mr. President, may I reiterate our call for collaborative, human-sensitive actions and solidarity. In this regard, we applaud the concerted continental regional actions taken by the African Union in response to the pandemic. These examples ought to be emulated at global level. Mr. President, Kenya is also pleased to have partnered with the United Nations in establishing a COVID-19 treatment center in Nairobi to provide critical care to UN peacekeepers and humanitarian personnel across our continent. In the spirit of further cooperation, Kenya recommends continued dialogue between this council and countries in conflict, countries hosting refugees, and humanitarian agencies to sharpen their response to COVID-19 and other emerging security challenges in a more effective and coordinated manner. We look forward to support in this. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Cabinet Secretary, for your contribution. I now turn and give the floor to the representative of Niger. The floor is yours.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, dear colleagues. Allow me at the outset to congratulate the United Kingdom for its commitment to keeping the question of the COVID-19 pandemic on the agenda of the Security Council. I'd like to take this opportunity to express our thanks to you for having given us a forum today to discuss how we can guarantee equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines in contexts affected by conflict and insecurity, which our briefers, Madam Henrietta Fore, Messrs. Jagan Chapagain and Seth Berkley, covered so brilliantly in their statements. Mr. President, despite the enormous difficulties facing small and large countries, rich or poor, to fight the pandemic, we have been given hope thanks to the excellent work of pharmaceutical companies, which has made it possible to provide vaccines, and the distribution and implementation has already begun. But as many leaders throughout the world have pointed out, the chain of our health security is only as strong as its weakest link. No country or region in the world can feel protected or secure so long as other countries or regions are not, because need we remind ourselves that this virus knows no borders. It's therefore imperative that we ensure that the distribution of the vaccine does not give rise to health responses which are protectionist or counterintuitive, where some countries might use this common good as an instrument to advance their hegemonic visions and give them advantages in other areas of influence, rather than providing a coordinated, inclusive and global international response. To date, it's estimated that countries that only have 60% of the global population have bought 60% of the global stock of vaccines. This artificial shortage, as it was so well described by the Director General of the WHO, is hampering the efforts of a number of countries, particularly in conflict areas, to meet the requirements of international humanitarian law, in particular the obligation to prevent and control epidemics and to guarantee access to healthcare, including vaccinations, without discrimination. The time has come here to salute the efforts of this organization to establish a humanitarian buffer guaranteeing up to 5% of vaccine doses through COVAX to be stockpiled for populations in need or in conflict areas, particularly those that have been displaced, migrants, asylum seekers, and others. My delegation supports this initiative through which African countries are able to acquire sufficient quantities of vaccine at affordable prices. Mr. President, notwithstanding the efforts of the heads of state and government of the African Union through the establishment of a process for the supply of vaccines, thanks to the COVAX facility, which is based on initiatives already taken by member states and by the international community, nevertheless, still a lot remains to be done to guarantee complete access to the vaccine for vulnerable populations in conflict and fragile contexts. In order for this access to be effective, the time has come to put genuine human solidarity into practice. Mr. President, guaranteeing that those living in conflict and fragile contexts receive the COVID-19 vaccine and are not left to their own devices through national or international vaccination programs requires us to overcome the main obstacles to the provision of vaccines in these countries via adequate preparation. The Council, and together with it the international community, must resolutely commit themselves to fighting this pandemic, which constitutes a genuine threat to international peace and security. We should also harness the experience gained by a number of countries, particularly in the fight against the Ebola virus. In this regard, the establishment of strong measures to ensure the availability of essential medical supplies, including lab material, PPE, and tests, is a tribute to the experience that those countries and over and above them the international community have gained from the Ebola crisis. No one can doubt the support of WHO and Gavi and other partners already committed. They will work to ensure the implementation of even more effective vaccination strategies. It's also very important to pay attention to awareness campaigns undertaken by governments in order to create a climate of confidence and overcome mistrust with regard to vaccines. In this regard, the involvement of young people and women, the private sector, civil society, and traditional and religious leaders in the design and preparation of communication strategies is more necessary than ever. In conclusion, I would like to affirm that today is not the time for words, it's the time for action, to honor the memory of all of our loved ones taken from us tragically in their millions by this terrible pandemic, so that, as Albert Camus said in his novel The Plague, we may learn that it is at times of pestilence that there are more things to admire in men than there are to despise. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you so much for your contribution and the interlude to Albert Camus. I will now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Over to you, sir.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. We'd like to thank the briefers for the information they provided. We're grateful to the UK presidency for organizing the meeting today on the issues which have to do with combating the coronavirus pandemic. One of the key elements of this fight is ensuring there is equitable and universal access to the vaccine against COVID-19. And for this, we need to have a portfolio of effective and safe medications. We need to help the interested member states in supplying the vaccines to those who need them. In our view, most of these issues is something that falls within the remit of specialized UN agencies, first and foremost the WHO, the General Assembly, and the ECOSOC. It is our view that a generalized discussion on this topic is something that is outside of the framework of the Security Council competency. Nonetheless, we stand ready to discuss the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2532 within the context of that which the Council deals with. Mr. President, the COVID-19 pandemic has become a severe test for all of us. And it showed that it is impossible to ensure epidemiological well-being in one individual country. And it also showed, therefore, how important it is to collectively pool efforts at the international level. In this context, Russia supports the central role of WHO as the multilateral mechanism to coordinate the reaction to the emergency health situation whilst respecting the sovereignty of its member states. Unfortunately, the global pandemic outbreak did not spare those countries which are in a conflict situation. And for them, the epidemic could worsen the already very serious humanitarian consequences of those. In turn, the fighting impedes the effective conduct of work to combat the epidemic. It represents a threat for the medical infrastructure, and it also diverts government resources from healthcare needs. And that is why Russia was amongst the first to support the Secretary General appeal for a universal ceasefire, and we continue underscoring the need to have a humanitarian pause in conflict areas. We, once again, here would like to underscore that in line with 2532, these measures do not apply to operations against internationally recognized terrorist groups, the groups which are only trying to benefit from the current situation so that to obtain advantages on the ground. We are also convinced that the risk of a worsening humanitarian situation in a conflict situation against the background of COVID-19 should be considered in close linkage to the specific country topics on the Security Council agenda. Despite the fact that because of the COVID restrictions, the UN peacekeeping operations are facing new challenges, so far the UN has managed avoiding a serious nefarious impact on their work. In our view, the efforts made by the Council in order to combat the pandemic need to be focused here on supporting the peacekeeping missions, making sure the peace settlement processes do go on, and on making sure that the appeal for universal ceasefire is being implemented. In this regard, we note the measures made by the Secretariat ensuring that there is immediate vaccination of the peacekeeping contingents in close contact with the group of friends from the interested countries. We think that the vaccinations themselves have to be voluntary. Mr. President, we must remind here that Security Council Resolution 2532 inter alia expresses this support to the appeal launched by the Secretary General to lift the illegal unilateral sanctions which undermine the capacity of impacted countries, especially developing countries, their ability to counter the pandemic and to ensure the socioeconomic recovery from its consequences. The persistent attempts of the proponents of this practice to be silent on this or dismiss it by reference to the non-functioning humanitarian exemptions do not resolve this issue. In this regard, we'd like to remind you of the President of Russia's initiative to introduce green corridors free of trade wars, free of sanctions, so as to provide the basic necessity goods and medications to those states which need them. Mr. President, Russia is contributing significantly to the global fight against COVID-19, including through ensuring people's access to safe and effective vaccinations. My country was one of the first to develop a coronavirus vaccines. Two of such vaccines, an adenoviral Sputnik V vaccine and the peptide vaccine, which is called Epivac Corona, have already received registration and are being administered. The third vaccine, which is called Covivac, is on the basis of a neutralized virus, is at an advanced stage and is awaiting registration. The outcome of the clinical trials for Sputnik V, published recently in the prestigious medical journal The Lancet, confirm that it's highly effective and safe. To date, This vaccine, which is much easier to store and transport, has been approved in 27 countries of Europe, Africa, Asia, Middle East, South and North America, and is amongst the 3 leading anti-COVID vaccines in terms of permits issued. Our vaccines are continuously being considered with a view of including them in the WHO emergency use listing. And of course, we can but agree and share the appeal launched by the State Secretary Blinken when he says that it is unacceptable to have the defamation of vaccine and that it is important to pool efforts. Russia has been extending assistance in fighting the pandemic. We sent 20 medical missions into 15 countries. We have supplied testing systems to 50 countries and also provide thousands of medical equipment units and millions of PPE units free of charge. And we continue our contacts with the COVID-19 Act Acceleration Initiative. We are open for cooperation with interested partners, so increase access to vaccines, medications, and PPE by local manufacturing. And we also stand ready for other kinds of international interactions so as to jointly combat the pandemic. In summary, we'd like to say that there is a great deal of unity among Security Council members when it comes to pooling efforts here and also against the misuse or abuse of vaccine for any purpose whatsoever. To date, this is the most important kind of assistance that we should extend to those who need it. Let me repeat our appeal, which is also applicable to other kinds of international assistance, that this needs to be depoliticized or any political preconditions for its extension are unacceptable. I thank you.
Well, thank you very much, representative of the Russian Federation. Now, colleagues, before concluding the meeting, I think I again want to reiterate the thanks that so many have already expressed for our briefers, but also just turn to them to give them just a last opportunity to provide any further comments or raise any specific points raised by council members during this debate. So let me just first of all offer the floor to Ms. Henrietta Fore. I don't know whether she would like to say anything further.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. May I just thank all of the council members for their remarks and support. At UNICEF, I'd like to reaffirm our commitment and our readiness to enable a truly equitable response. And Mr. President, Secretary Raab, you called on us to be a team. Today, we are a team and we are in the fight. So thank you very much.
Well, no, thank you very much. Now let me also turn to give the floor one last time to Mr. Jagan Chapgayan. Would you like to say anything further, sir?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Raab, and thank you for this opportunity. Also on behalf of the 14 million Red Cross Red Crescent volunteers who are actually in the front line, really supporting this pandemic, but also many other humanitarian crises. I think they would be very happy that their voice was heard by the Security Council today. What we say here today really matters. What we do after today matters. Our ability to respond effectively to this pandemic and indeed to future health emergencies relies heavily on how much we are trusted as member states and also as humanitarian groups. We will be trusted if we consistently demonstrate our willingness to listen and beyond that to act on what we've done. We need to counteract the voices of cynicism and misinformation that are too often dominating community discussion about COVID-19. We also need to deliver on the promise we have all made to ensure equity in the distribution of COVID-19 vaccine, and I join Henrietta in reaffirming that commitment. I think people see this, if we are meeting those commitments or not. They recognize the inherent unfairness, and they will judge us unless we deliver on the fairness that they need, and that coincidentally is the only means of effectively ending this pandemic. Finally, let me again recognize the tremendous courage and dedication of all frontline healthcare workers, including the millions of volunteers who have given of themselves to support our collective efforts. Let's celebrate them by ensuring that they are safe and protected. They must not be left to deal with the often violent consequences of the mistrust and inequity that has too often defined this pandemic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you so much. Now let me offer Dr. Barkley the opportunity for any further reflections.
So I'd like to join my fellow panelists and congratulate President Raab and the UK for this first ever Security Council briefing on vaccines. Extraordinary. And I think we as a world have to celebrate the amazing science. The world came together 326 days from the publishing of the genome to the first approved product. And so I think this is miraculous. I was so happy to hear the consensus on the importance of global equitable access, including in humanitarian setting, by every speaker. I also was pleased to hear about the new level of multilateralism required, even a new multilateralism. I certainly am proud that 190 countries have come together to work together, and I really appreciate all the support from members towards COVAX were described here. I also really appreciated to hear the support for restoring routine vaccines to prevent parallel epidemics, but as well as strengthening resilient health systems, not just for this epidemic, but for future epidemics. For me, it's critical that members of this august body not only provide the necessary financial support that was discussed, but the political leadership to put pressures on countries to work together on equitable access, including in humanitarian settings, and put pressure and incentives to companies to maximize volumes of productions of vaccines through tech transfer and strengthening facilities. This is particularly important given the wave of new variants where we're going to have to work together as a global community to adjust the vaccines and move this forward, not just for wealthy countries. So again, level of consensus and unity is striking. We and our partners need all of your help, and we look forward to working with you. Again, thank you for coming up.
Thank you, Dr. Barkley. Thank you so much.
Microphone on the call. Everyone, please ensure that your microphones are muted at this time.
We've done so well with people staying on mute and coming off mute at the right time. Please put yourself on mute if you're not already.
She actually was on.
Very good. Thank you very much. Can I thank all of our excellent briefers? I think they've done a great job for us today, and there are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. So I would just like to close by thanking again every one of the distinguished participants who have joined us today. I want to thank the member states, the regional groupings who have also, on top of the contributions we've had here, have also submitted written statements. We've had some very powerful contributions, and I think overall a real clarion call to action, which we must now take forward. I should also say that any further statements that we get by the end of the day will form part of the record. So please do put them in if there are any that are poised to be concluded. I think overall, finally, I would just say that having listened to members' statements very carefully, I think we're all seized of the importance of the issues and, in fairness, the challenges that we face today. And what's really important now is that our actions match the seriousness of the moment. So I'm looking forward very much to working with all of you to deliver on this, to pass this resolution and to take all of the other necessary steps that we need to take to make sure that no one is left behind as we come out of this pandemic. I think that the world rightly looks to the United Nations at moments like this, and we must deliver. The UK will play its full part, its full role in that effort, but I think we're all clear that this is going to be a team effort. So again, thank you all so much for your contributions, and I look forward to working with you in the weeks and months ahead. The meeting is adjourned.